You ever get this, like, this feeling, like the really, really deep stuff, like what it all means, how we work, how the world works, like it's all been, like, figured out already?
Yeah, just like dressed up differently at different times.
Right, exactly. Like,
Yeah.
imagine some ancient dude meditating under a tree.
And then cut to like a therapist today, analyzing dreams in their office.
Totally, and they're both, like, tapping into the same, I don't know, the same frequency, the same truth.
That's a really cool way to think about it. And it kind of leads us right into what we're looking at today.
Yes, we're diving deep, deep dive here into some pretty fascinating ideas from someone who, it seems like, has really spent time with both Jung and Eastern mystical traditions.
Yeah, like really connecting those dots, seeing how these things, Jungian psychology, Eastern mysticism, they kind of echo each other.
It's wild different, like on the surface, totally different, but then boom, these deep resonances. And for you, dear learner, we're going to try to distill the heart of it all, the core insights.
Yeah, like what's the essence of this whole idea of, spiritual cultivation?
That's a big one, right? Like, how do we wrap our heads around that? And then on top of that, how do our minds, like our everyday minds, how do they even begin to grasp something that vast?
It's a journey for sure. And it's worth remembering, Jung himself wasn't like averse to all this. I mean, he was super into Eastern thought.
Oh yeah, he was all about it.
Taoism, Kabbalah, all of it. And some of the key ideas he's known for, like that collective unconscious, really resonate with ancient Eastern ideas about a kind of universal consciousness.
Right, like we're all swimming in the same ocean, just different like expressions of it.
Totally.
And speaking of oceans, one thing that keeps coming up in our source material here is this idea that the Tao, that central concept from the Tao Te Ching, it's like beyond words.
Yeah, it's like, how do you describe the indescribable?
Right. And our source, they really emphasize how language, concepts, they're great. We need them to navigate the world. But when it comes to describing ultimate reality,
They fall short.
totally short. Like trying to, capture the ocean in a teacup, right? You get a taste, but you miss the vastness.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is how much our own personal stuff comes into play,
Yeah.
Like our individual experiences, our biases, the culture we come from, all of it. It acts like a filter.
So like you say apple, I think fruit, someone else thinks iPhone.
Yes, same word, completely different images.
And what's trippy is that this is happening with really big concepts, profound truths, often things you can only really grasp through like lived experience.
Which is why I think our source is saying that sometimes those who have really gone deep, they're a little hesitant to like over-rely on written words.
It's like the minute you put it down on paper, it loses something,
It becomes dead water, as they say,
Yeah.
compared to that, like living water of direct experience.
That really makes sense to me. Because if the tools we're using to even talk about this stuff are already kind of flawed, or at least limited,
Yeah, and colored by our own unique lens.
then it's no wonder things get lost in translation, right? Literally, and just in trying to understand each other.
Absolutely. But this also brings us to a really cool idea.
Okay, yeah.
So, despite all these hurdles, these linguistic limitations, what if there's still this, like, fundamental core, something shared across all these seemingly different spiritual paths?
Oh, okay, I like where this is going.
Our source brings up the idea that maybe traditions like Taoism and Christianity, for example.
Yeah, they seem pretty different on the surface.
Right. But what if they're ultimately pointing towards similar realities, they're just using different vocabulary?
So like different maps, but leading to the same treasure.
Exactly. Think about, in Taoism, you have this idea of achieving a pure yang body, or even immortality.
Okay, and in the Bible, you have eternal life.
Yeah. Different language.
Yeah.
But could they be talking about, like, a similar ultimate state of being?
Fascinating. But then, wouldn't all the differences, like all the rules and rituals and stuff?
Yeah, well, the source suggests that some of that might be, how do you say, stuff that got added on later, maybe through misunderstandings as teachings were passed down.
Like that telephone game we used to play. It starts simple, and then by the end, it's totally different.
Right. But except here, instead of just a funny sentence, it's, people's entire spiritual frameworks. And then you have to think about power dynamics,
people wanting to control things, maybe their own agendas creeping in.
Exactly. Which can lead to all these rigid dogmas that maybe weren't even part of the original intent.
And that takes us right to this idea that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this whole thing.
No magic bullet, right?
Our source uses this great analogy about a doctor who has to diagnose the root cause of an illness instead of just like handing out the same meds to everyone with a cough.
Right, because what works for one person might be totally useless or even harmful for someone else.
Makes total sense. Like, what really gets me going on my spiritual path might be like crickets for you.
Totally. And it goes deeper. Because our source talks about how each person's natural tendencies, their strengths and weaknesses, they kind of necessitate different approaches.
So if someone's like super prone to overindulgence, maybe they need a really disciplined practice.
Exactly, to build up that self-control muscle. But someone who's already super rigid, maybe they need something more fluid, more compassionate.
So we all come in with different stuff to work on. Our source even uses this idea that each soul, when it comes into this world, it's already kind of in a sick state.
Carrying the weight of all this accumulated karma.
Whoa, so we're all starting from different points on the map with different baggage.
Yeah, different needs, different starting points, different paths. And that's why, these Taoist doctors, people with that really deep holistic understanding.
The kind that can see all the levels, the spiritual, the physical, even the cosmic.
They're rare, right? Because to truly guide someone, you have to see the whole intricate web of their being.
It really paints a picture of a much more complex and interconnected reality than we usually think about.
Absolutely. And this leads to a really important point about self-cultivation.
Which I'm guessing is where the self in self-cultivation comes in.
Exactly. Our source is all about this idea of self-healing, taking responsibility for your own growth.
So you can't just wait around for someone to hand you enlightenment on a silver platter.
Not according to this perspective. Prophets, or what they call doctors of a sick society, they can point out the general problems, the wrong turns we're taking as a collective.
But the real work, the inner transformation, that's on us.
100%. Now, our source points out that certain negative tendencies, they seem to be pretty universal across cultures. Greed, anger, ignorance, pride, doubt.
Like classic bad guys, huh?
Right. But then they also acknowledge that each culture might have its own kind of collective unconscious, its own set of predispositions.
So like the basic human flaws are the same, but how they play out might be influenced by our cultural context.
Precisely. They even mentioned the Mahabharata, that ancient Indian epic, as an example of how certain attitudes towards women were ingrained in that society.
Wow, so we're talking about layers upon layers of conditioning here. And all this ties back to the idea that the world we see, with all its imperfections, is actually a reflection of
our collective inner state.
So we're all kind of walking each other through this, for better or worse.
Yeah, it's like a giant mirror reflecting back all our individual struggles and triumphs. And speaking of struggles, our source brings up this idea of an inner battle, which seems pretty central to this whole self-cultivation thing.
Okay, let's unpack that. What exactly are we battling against here?
Well, they're saying the biggest obstacles we face aren't actually out there in the world, but inside us. They call them our inner demons.
Oh, so those negative tendencies we were talking about, they're the real enemies.
Exactly. These ingrained patterns of thought and behavior that cause so much suffering. The source even makes this cool connection to Plato's allegory of the cave.
Oh yeah, the one with the shadows on the wall.
Right. So they're saying what we perceive as reality, our judgments, our projections, it's often just a reflection of what's going on inside us.
So the monsters that we think are out there are actually just our own shadows.
Exactly, which is why self-reflection is so important, right? Turning our attention inward to get to the root of the problem.
Instead of always trying to fix what's outside.
Right. They even suggest that conflicts in our closest relationships, like the biblical story of Jacob and Esau, can be seen as outward manifestations of inner conflicts.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it.
It really flips the script, right? Instead of always looking outward for solutions, we need to start by looking within.
So how do we start winning this inner battle? How do we conquer these demons?
Well, our source suggests that all genuine spiritual traditions, no matter how different they seem on the surface, are ultimately trying to help us do exactly that.
Overcome these negative tendencies and become pure again?
Exactly. To return to a state of inner purity and wholeness. Like the saying, return to the state of a child to enter the kingdom of God. Or in Taoism, there's this idea of the heart of a newborn child.
Pure, innocent, full of potential.
Exactly. And the first step, the foundation, is cultivating self-control, which is often talked about in terms of ship or precepts.
Like rules for how to live.
Yeah, guidelines. In Buddhism, they have the concept of sila, which encompasses ethical conduct, disciplined living.
So no cutting corners on the inner work.
Not according to our source. They even caution against trying to jump ahead, like trying to run before you can walk, trying to open the third eye or reach some advanced state without doing the groundwork.
It's like trying to build a house without a foundation.
Exactly. It's like stirring muddy water. You just make it cloudier. And they also make a point about, sharing spiritual insights before you're really ready.
Oh, like giving advice when you haven't actually mastered it yourself.
Right. Without that inner clarity, you risk distorting the information, maybe even misguiding others.
That makes sense. You need a clear vessel to transmit that kind of deep knowledge. Now, our source talks about this idea of hui guang, which they translate as returning the light.
Yeah, it's a Taoist concept.
What exactly does that mean?
So it's about shifting your focus. Instead of being caught up in all the external distractions, you turn your attention inward.
So less outward, more inward.
Exactly. And they emphasize that real wisdom, true understanding, it comes from that inner realization, not just from reading books.
Not just head knowledge, right?
Right. It's the difference between dead knowledge and living water, as they put it.
I like that. So it's about connecting with something deeper, something beyond just the intellect.
Exactly. And this connects to a couple of important Taoist ideas, the original spirit and the conscious spirit.
Okay, those sound pretty deep. Break those down for me.
So the original spirit is kind of like our pure essential nature, our connection to the Tao.
And the conscious spirit.
Then that's more like our everyday mind, the part of us that gets caught up in thoughts, desires, all the worldly stuff.
So one's more pure, connected to the source, and the other's more like entangled in the world.
You got it. And our source actually draws parallels to some Kabbalistic ideas here, the neshama, which is like the divine soul, and the nefesh, which is more like the animal soul.
So similar concepts in different traditions.
Exactly. And they use the story of Jacob and Esau to illustrate these two aspects within us.
Oh yeah, those biblical twins, always at odds with each other.
Right. And the ultimate goal, they're saying, is for those two aspects to reconcile, for us to integrate our higher and lower natures.
That's a powerful image, those two seemingly opposite parts of ourselves coming together.
It is. And they also tell this story about a poor, wise youth and a foolish, rich king. You might find it in Proverbs, I think.
Okay, haven't read that one.
It's an allegory for how our divine, wise nature can get overshadowed by our more impulsive, less wise tendencies.
So like, we all have that inner wisdom, but it can get drowned out by all the other noise.
Exactly. And the ultimate goal is for that original spirit to return to its source, which is likened to waking up from a dream.
Like Zhuangzi's butterfly dream.
Exactly. This all ties back to the Tao Te Ching's teachings about going beyond the distractions of the senses. 5 colors blind the eye, great sound is silent, great form is formless.
It's about moving beyond the surface level, the appearances, to perceive a deeper reality.
Right. And meditation, plays a big role in this.
Ah, okay. So how does that fit in?
So it's all about quieting the mind, reducing those wandering thoughts that just constantly take up our attention.
And how do you do that exactly? Just sit there and try to think about nothing?
Well, they talk about the connection between breath and thoughts.
Okay.
By slowing down and regulating your breath, you can start to calm the mind.
Interesting. Like using the breath as an anchor.
Right. And they even mention this state called fetal breathing.
Whoa, what's that?
It's like a really deep, natural state of stillness.
Like how babies breathe in the womb.
Exactly. But they also warn about some common misunderstandings about meditation,
Like what?
like trying to force an empty mind.
Oh, I've tried that. It doesn't work.
Yeah, it can actually be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And also, getting attached to any visions or weird experiences that might come up.
Right, that can be distracting.
Yeah, the real goal is to extinguish the discriminating mind.
The what now?
It's that part of us that constantly judges, labels, categorizes everything.
Oh, that one. Always active.
And that's seen as the root of desire and suffering.
So it's not just about emptying the mind, it's about transforming how it works.
Precisely. And they even connect this to that story of Adam and Eve eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge.
That's a pretty deep connection. So by judging, by labeling things as good and bad, we're kind of
Falling into duality.
and creating suffering in the process.
Right. Now, our source doesn't limit this whole thing to formal practices like meditation, though.
Oh, so it's not just about sitting on a cushion.
Exactly. They say it should permeate our everyday lives by striving to be unattached to outcomes, to live authentically.
So like bringing mindfulness into everything you do.
Yeah. They even use this metaphor of bathing the heart and mind.
So constantly cleansing, purifying.
Exactly. And they bring this great quote from Confucius, following the heart's desire without transgressing the boundaries.
That's a good one.
They say that's the ultimate state of alignment with the Tao.
So like your inner compass is perfectly attuned to the natural order of things.
Exactly. And speaking of alignment, they also talk about the difference between outward shows of piety and genuine inner transformation.
Like doing all the right things but not actually feeling it.
Right. They mention the Buddhist idea that actions done with an expectation of reward don't really count.
It's all about the intention.
Exactly. They emphasize how truly enlightened people, they're humble, they don't need external validation.
So real change is happening on the inside, not just for show.
Exactly. And they acknowledge how difficult it is to really communicate this stuff,
Yeah, words can only go so far.
Especially when it comes to these profound experiential truths. Ultimately, they say, true understanding comes from direct realization, not just intellectual grasp.
Like you have to feel it in your bones, not just understand it in your head.
Exactly. And this takes us to a really important idea, this concept of an objective reality that exists beyond our individual perceptions.
So like a truth that's true regardless of what we think about it.
Precisely. The Tao is presented as this objective principle, something that operates regardless of whether we understand it or believe in it or not.
Okay.
And to grasp it, we have to go beyond our own limited viewpoints or biases.
So like step outside our own heads.
Exactly. They even compare it to science, how researchers are always searching for an underlying reality beyond what they can observe.
So like scientists are searching for the laws of physics and spiritual seekers are searching for the laws of
Existence itself.
the Tao.
Right. They even use this image of a lizard losing its tail to show how our concepts, they're often just fragmented glimpses of the whole.
So we're only seeing a tiny part of the picture.
Exactly. And they say we need to connect with the Tao heart, that objective reality beyond our own opinions and desires.
That's a nice image, the Tao heart.
They also use a really cool analogy with Wi-Fi signals.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So they're saying the Tao is always present, like a Wi-Fi signal, but whether we can pick it up depends on how clear our channels are.
So if our minds are all cluttered with like mental static,
Then we can't connect to the signal.
but if we clear out that interference, then
We can tune into the Tao.
that's a really helpful way to think about it. Now, our source also touches on this whole debate about destiny versus free will.
Yeah, that's a tricky one.
They acknowledge this idea that there's a certain amount of predetermination, that our past actions, our karma, kind of set things in motion.
They even mention this concept of mazel, destiny or luck, from Jewish mysticism.
Okay, interesting. But it sounds like they're not saying we're completely powerless.
Right. They emphasize that our present attitude, the choices we make, they still matter.
So even if there's a current carrying us along, we can still steer the boat a little bit.
Exactly. And even if our past actions have consequences, we can transform how we relate to those consequences.
So taking responsibility, but also choosing how we respond.
Exactly. And they emphasize that ultimately each person's path to realizing the Tao is unique.
Which brings us back to that idea of a deeply personal journey, even though the ultimate destination might be universal.
Precisely. And then there's this fascinating interplay between desire and non-desire.
Okay, another tricky one. How do they break that down?
So they introduce these concepts of Tao desire and Tao non-desire, DOI.
Okay, a lot to unpack there.
Right. So Tao desire is kind of like the inherent force of the Tao in action, the natural unfolding of things.
And Tao non-desire.
That represents the essence of the Tao, its unmanifest nature.
Okay, so one's more about movement, action, and the other's more about stillness, being.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And they suggest that even things we see as negative, like our difficult emotions or cravings,
They can actually serve a purpose.
yeah, they might be a way for the Tao to show us what needs to be transformed.
So, like, those dark parts of ourselves, they're not necessarily bad, they're just pointing to something.
Exactly. But they also caution against being overly judgmental before you've done some serious inner work.
So, like, don't get too caught up in labeling everything as good or bad.
Right, that can actually hold you back, create a kind of spiritual indigestion. They emphasize that growth is gradual, organic.
like a seed slowly growing into a tree.
Exactly. You can't rush it.
And speaking of growth, they also talk about the importance of cultivating inner purity.
Yeah, that's a big one. They delve into the relationship between our inherent nature, which is connected to our original spirit.
That pure essence we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And our physical life, our bodies, our health.
So taking care of our physical selves is also part of the path.
Absolutely. They even draw parallels between traditional Chinese medicine and some Jewish traditions that emphasize holistic well-being.
So mind, body, spirit, it's all connected.
Exactly. And they say respecting the Creator and living a virtuous life is key to both our physical and spiritual health.
So like those commandments or mitzvah are not just arbitrary rules, they're
guidelines for living in harmony with the universe.
and cultivating self-control.
Right. And interestingly, they mention a connection between self-control and activity in the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain responsible for decision-making and planning.
So like there's a neurological basis for these ancient wisdom teachings.
Pretty cool, right? And they end this section with a warning.
Uh-oh, what's the warning?
Don't try to jump into advanced spiritual practices without a solid foundation in ethical conduct.
So no shortcuts.
Not if you want to avoid some potentially negative consequences. They even talk about, like, entering demonic states.
Okay, that doesn't sound good.
Not at all. It's about balance, you know? You need a strong ethical base before you start reaching for those higher levels.
Makes sense. Now, let's dive into how our source talks about the nature of reality.
Okay, so they present this idea that the material world, what we perceive through our senses, it's all actually a manifestation of the Tao.
Whoa, so it's not as solid as it seems.
Not really. They use this great analogy about water and snow.
Both H2O, but in different forms.
Exactly. So they're saying everything we experience, it's ultimately an illusion arising from the Tao, perceived through our limited senses.
So, like, the world's a movie projected onto the screen of our minds.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the problem, they say, is that we cling to these illusions. We mistake them for ultimate reality.
Which creates delusions.
Exactly. And keeps us trapped in this cycle of reincarnation or...
So it's about seeing through those illusions, recognizing that everything's impermanent, constantly changing.
Exactly. They contrast this unenlightened view where people are always striving for greatness, chasing after fleeting things.
With the enlightened view, where you recognize that we're all interconnected, like waves in the ocean.
Exactly. And this leads to a really profound realization. My mind is the universe. All things are complete in me.
So instead of seeing yourself as separate, you understand that everything is already within you.
Precisely. Which leads to detachment, freedom from those worldly desires and anxieties.
Now, all this talk about inner work and realizing the Tao, it makes me wonder, how important are our intentions in all this?
Oh, they're essential. Our source makes a clear distinction between, like, doing spiritual practices for selfish reasons.
Like wanting to gain superpowers or something?
Yeah. Or even just wanting recognition. They contrast that with genuine spiritual practice, which is selfless, done without attachment to results.
So it's not about what you get out of it, it's about the doing itself.
Exactly. And they even say that challenges, difficulties, they're all part of our individual journey.
So even the tough stuff is an opportunity for growth.
Precisely. They make this point that true wisdom doesn't come solely from the intellect. It comes from direct experience, from intuitive understanding.
Not just reading about it, but living it.
Right. They have this quote, "Sin, to accumulate knowledge day by day, but to follow the Tao is to diminish our ego and attachments day by day."
It's about letting go of the need to know everything and just being present with what is.
Exactly. They also use this great analogy. Imagine trying to describe the taste of an apple to someone who's never tasted one.
Yeah, you can use all the words in the world, but they'll never truly understand until they experience it.
Right. And that's what realizing the Tao is like. And they emphasize that everyone's path is unique.
So no one right way to do it.
Exactly. It's about finding what works for you.
Now, given all that, I'm curious about the role of community versus solitude on this path.
Yeah, they touch on that too.
What do they say?
So they acknowledge that spiritual community, or sangha, can be really helpful.
Like having people to support you, guide you.
Exactly. Especially given all the potential pitfalls on the path. But then they also bring up the Taoist sage Zhuangzi's idea of forgetting each other in the rivers and lakes.
Which sounds pretty solitary.
Right. That emphasizes the importance of focusing on your direct connection with the Tao.
Rather than getting too caught up in relationships, needing validation from others.
Exactly. So it seems like there's a balance to be found.
between connection and independence.
Right. And they also warn about trying to force enlightenment.
Like trying to hack the system.
Yeah, they say it's absurd. It's like trying to grind a brick into a mirror.
Ouch.
Right.
Yeah.
All those techniques, they're only useful if you're doing the inner work.
So it's not about finding the right method, it's about...
Cultivating the right inner state.
And they emphasize relying on the power of the Tao itself.
A noble person relies on the source, as they say.
So it's about aligning ourselves with that natural flow, rather than trying to impose our will.
Exactly. Now, they also touch on the concept of faith briefly.
Oh, that's a big one. What do they say about that?
They caution against seeing it as passive waiting,
Just sitting around hoping for the best.
Right. It's not about that. They also mention this idea of karma and repentance from Jewish thought, taking responsibility for your actions.
Okay.
And they contrast how the world sees death and life versus how someone who's realized the Tao sees them.
So our whole perspective on life, on death, changes as we evolve.
It's a radical shift. And ultimately, it's all about returning to the source.
Coming full circle.
Exactly. Aligning ourselves so fully with the Tao that our actions naturally flow with it.
That sounds pretty effortless.
They say it's like ape home.
Following the heart's desire without transgressing the boundaries.
Exactly. And they warn against the dangers of ego, of self-deception.
That ego can be tricky, always sneaking in.
Right. And they emphasize that true starts with character development, with cultivating self-control.
So it's not just about esoteric practices, it's about becoming a good person.
Exactly. And they remind us that we all have this Buddha nature, this original spirit within us.
But it's covered up by all our delusions.
Well, by all those, in realizing unexcelled perfect enlightenment, it's about removing those obscurations.
So we're all potentially enlightened beings, we just have to clear away the gunk?
Yeah. They contrast people who just go through the motions of religious practice.
Versus those who are genuinely seeking inner transformation.
Right. And they emphasize the importance of returning to that childlike heart,
But that's easier said than done, right?
Oh, definitely. Especially with all those worldly attachments we accumulate.
All that stuff we cling to.
Exactly. They say those who are caught in cycles of greed, anger, self-indulgence, they're far from the Tao.
So it's not just about meditating, it's about how we live our lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they say the key to breaking free from that cycle of birth and death is to see through the illusions of the material world.
And transcend that discriminating mind, that tendency to judge and divide.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the unity of all things.
So to sum it all up, we've explored how the very way we use language shapes our understanding of ultimate reality.
And how different spiritual traditions might actually be pointing to a similar truth.
And how important inner work is, versus just focusing on external practices.
And how crucial it is to cultivate a pure heart, free from attachment and judgment.
Whew, that was a deep dive. And for you, dear learner, remember, this journey of exploring these ideas, it's all part of your own personal hike.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, maybe take a moment to reflect on those inner demons we talked about.
How are they showing up in your life? And what small steps can you take to cultivate that childlike heart, that sense of wonder and non-attachment?
What might it mean for you to see without seeing or hear without hearing in your everyday experiences?